Okay. And he has now another point of view to what you can do with contact tracing, given the recent incidences in US about manipulation of election systems. And now Rosario presents his research on voter suppression. Rosario, please.
Thank you. I'm hesitant to call this research, and I'll talk a little more in the talk, because there isn't much in terms of crypto and technical points in this talk. But I just want to sort of go over the experience of the last 6 months in dealing with the Google and Apple contact tracing framework and the potential for voter suppression, given that we just came out a very divisive and strange and scary political election in the United States. So here's the outline of my talk. I'm just going to briefly talk about the deployment of contact tracing apps in the US, how they can be used to suppress voters, and the particular case of the US electoral system. And I'll then recall our experience, the experience of the people that I work on this together with during the last 6 months, and sort of make some comments about what should we think for the future. So
just
again,
a short question.
Yeah.
Do you want to use your camera or just?
Oh, am I still? Sorry, I thought I was.
Not now.
Now I don't know how to do that.
Okay, wait a second. I can, as a host, I can.
Because I lost the window with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I will do it.
Great, thanks. All right. So again, I most of the talks is about, I would call it activism rather than research. And I worked on this with 2 friends, basically. James Krallenstein, that works for Prep for All, which is a public health advocacy organization. And I'm Adam Krallenstein, who's a CTO of a blockchain startup. But again, neither of us is really, except for Prep for All of us have been sort of come in as private citizens rather than as in our official, research capabilities, right? All right, so contact tracing in the US. In the US, public health is mostly the domain of the individual states. And therefore, there was not a coordinated response across the entire country. And the situation was actually even worsened by the total lack of coordination on anything, not just the apps, in the management of the pandemic from the federal government. Therefore, contact tracing apps were developed on individual states one by one. And the first one that was launched was the state of Virginia in August. All the states in the US followed the GAN framework. Up to now, only 17 states have apps that are working. There are 3 additional states that are planning to release it soon. At the beginning, each state was completely independent. There was no interoperability. When GAN was then rolled out as part of the operating system, then many more states now got into the system, and now they're more interoperable because they use a national exposure servers, which is run by the Association of Public Health Laboratories, as opposed to individual exposure servers run by each state. Adoption rates are incredibly low. Here's a picture from the Sources Time magazine from November, and they put Ireland for comparison, but these are the percentages on the states. And again, remember, only 17 states have deployed at this point the app. So the app is not basically being used in the United States. Why? The main narrative revolves around privacy concern for the users, and yet there is also a more subtle reason, which is paradoxically the reason Guyana apps are being chosen by the states, which is low funding. It's a very simple, very off-the-shelf, low entry point for cash-strapped states, but at the same time, they have no budget for advertising, which is also thought of as a reason for low adoption. In fact, the adoption rates in Virginia and Delaware, which are higher, are positively correlated with their advertising spending on the app. Low adoption is how I ended up getting involved. I really wasn't following this. Sometimes when I look at very active crypto research areas as shark-infested waters, and I try to stay away from them. And in this case, what happened was that during the summer, Prep for All was contacted by the Linux Foundation. And the reason they contacted Prep for All is that they've been a very, very successful organization advocating for the availability of PrEP therapy for HIV prophylaxis. This has been one of the great successes of public health in the US. PrEP, which if you guys don't know, is a daily pill that you can take that would prevent you from getting HIV, has had a very high adoption rate among gay men in the US. And therefore, PrEP for All was sort of contacted to sort of help strategize what would be a messaging around the apps that would get them adopted, given that had such great success with, the adoption of PrEP in our own community. Well, I'm not affiliated with Prep for All. I'm friends with many of their members, and they sort of, because they know I'm a cryptographer, I ended up getting involved. And sometimes I wish I didn't, but again, I look at this project more as activism than research, because at the end, the technical contribution was not that high. So this is just in case somebody just joined this webinar, because I'm sure you have seen this slide several times, how Guyana works. Phones have a master key that generates this random numbers, which are called rolling proximity identifiers. That's a function of this key and the current time. These RPIs are recorded by phones which are in the proximity of the generating phone. And if you test positive, you have the choice of uploading your keys to a exposure server, which is constantly checked by other devices, and to download the keys of the infected individual and then check if there is a match on the RPIs. If there is, then you've been exposed. Again, and then it just gave a very good description. We know that there are serious attacks on the integrity of GAN, meaning that it doesn't protect against replay attacks. The codes can be easily captured. These RPIs can be easily captured and rebroadcast in different locations. If those RPIs are then associated with an infected individual, notification would be sent to users who are not in the proximity of infected individuals. And those notified individuals would probably isolate unnecessarily as a result. How do you launch these relay attacks? Well, there are two main ways. One could be to plant some malware on phones. So a rogue app could access the Bluetooth service and broadcast certain RPIs, and therefore turning unsuspected users into Bluetooth beacons. Another attack is a physical attack in which you actually deploy Bluetooth antennas that broadcast these RPIs. How do you get RPIs of infected people? Well, those could be obtained by scanning RPIs at hospital or testing sites. There could be a black market trade. Once you get infected, you can maybe sell your RPIs on a black market. You can bribe lab technician to get for yourself a fake infection, or you may even be willing to get yourself infected if you're so determined to launch this relay attack. How can you use this as voter suppression? Well, pretty straightforward, right? You can attack the population. So you can mount a large-scale relay attack targeting specific geographic areas that are known to be leaning for a certain political candidate. And you can launch that attack in the days before the election, leading many people to stay home and don't go to vote. You can also attack the voting infrastructure. You can target, for example, postage facilities to delay the processing of mail-in ballots that would eventually ended up being discarded, either because they were post-stamped too late or because they were delivered too late. And by the way, these two events both happened in the last US election, not because of a attack on the apps, but just because of the sheer number of mail ballots that happened this year that completely strained the capacity of the USPS. There were few court cases around mail ballots that had been mailed according to the rules, but had not been processed in time by the USPS, and what should we do with those ballots? So imagine if on top of that, you would have half of the employees of the entire workforce of certain strategically chosen postal facilities, what would have happened to those mail-in ballots? On top of that, the US electoral system is inherently fragile. Very small perturbations in voter turnout can affect the result in a dramatic way, which means the attack doesn't have to be very large to be successful. There's a classic political science work from 2007. The title is really funny. It says, "Republicans Should Opt for Rain." They showed that lower turnout due to rain in very few select districts of the United States probably flipped the outcome of at least 2 US presidential elections. And normally low turnouts usually favor the Republicans. And so we asked ourselves the question, how does getting a notification of exposure to COVID-19 compares to a rainy day? And are we giving an adversary the ability to selectively make rains in certain parts of the country? So that was our concern. So what would be a successful attack? A successful attack would be one that would suppress enough votes to flip the result of the election. But an effective attack could also be one that is successful at delegitimizing the result by injecting a sufficient amount of mistrust into the electoral process. And I'll go back to that later in the talk. So therefore, even a small scale attack may be sufficient. When we started working on this, I had not paid much attention to until July to the literature. I didn't know that there were controversies. I had not seen Serge talk at Eurocrypt. I really had very little knowledge of what happened. So I started looking at what had been published around GAN. And although relay attacks have been discussed, we didn't find much pointing out the specific voter suppression threat. Eventually, after we started circulating our worries, we were contacted by Ashkan Soltani, who used to be the chief technologist for the Federal Communication Commission, I think, under the Obama administration. And he said that he had actually written a column from the Brookings Institution about all the problems with contact tracing apps, including the possible threat to voter suppression. He had contacted Google and Apple, but he had received no response from them. To note that he's a person who has his job is a privacy watchdog person, and therefore has always been very critical of Google and Apple, and therefore there's already like an history there. That's why he did not receive any response. And it isn't clear to me if or when Google and Apple technical teams were specifically aware of this particular threat. As I was talking to a Google engineer before we disclosed our note, the replay attack were dismissed as, the only thing that can happen is a bunch of people get tested and they'll come up negative. So what? So I'm not sure if they were aware of the specific threat. So what do? We wrote a note detailing our concern. We circulated privately among security and cryptography researchers and public health activists. And we sent it to Google and Apple. We got some traction there, as opposed to Mr. Sultani, who had not received any response. We actually were contacted back, and we had several meetings with both technical teams at Google and Apple discussing the issues and the possible countermeasures. So although we were not happy with the response, we appreciated that they took their time to talk to us and sort of take us seriously. We also advocated with various elected officials, and our advocacy there was pointing to not to tell them don't adopt GAN, because we thought that train had long left the station. So we chose a very pragmatic objective, which was, let's focus right now on removing the threats from the upcoming elections. We basically asked that we would like to suspend notifications on the week before election day. This would not address any of the problems with the framework per se, but would mitigate the particular threat to the US election. And this would be a very realistic, pragmatic solution with minimal public health implications. We didn't mean for our note to be public. This again, it was never done as getting a paper or publishing or getting press. We were just focused on trying to get this objective that notifications would be suspended. But eventually our note became public and was picked by the general media, which led to our relationship with Google and Apple to a little bit degenerate. So what was the main response that we received from Google, Apple, and the supporters of GAN in the academic community when we started discussing this attack? The criticism was that this would never happen because it's not a rational path for an adversary for two reasons. One is the attack requires too many resources and investment. And two, you can do this a lot. We can create this kind of attacks a lot more easily by running misinformation campaigns on social media. A very famous cryptographer can be quoted as saying, you can do this much better by texting people and telling there is an outbreak at their polling station. I found it very hard to address this kind of response, but to me, there are two problems inherent with this response. And the first one is that when we say too many resources and investment, we have to qualify who the attacker is. And,
excuse me,
yeah.
5 minutes left.
Oh, wow, okay. So a nation state may choose to invest in such an attack, and a small sector may suffice to delegitimize the result. And misinformation campaigns, they build fake sources that look reliable, and here the attack subverts an official public health government channel. And so we're providing the adversary a way to reach populations that may not be easily fooled. I would not believe a fake news campaign that I read on Facebook, but I would believe an official communication on my phone that I've been exposed. So there are some countermeasures, and now I'm running out of time, but you can find them in the risk and mitigation FAQ for GAN. Well, one is that only infected individuals can upload keys, but we know that this can easily bypass. You can monitor for test positivity rates, and this test positivity rates go way down, then you know that there is an attack. But this could work in general, but it wouldn't stop the attack. And for the specific case of water suppression, this would be too slow. There is, so one thing that we were not aware is that on Apple operating system, iOS, you cannot have malware that broadcasts RPIs because the UUID is reserved only for GAN apps. This is not possible on Android. Instead, and this was apparently ramped up after our note, there is a Google Play review process for apps that detect possible abuse of the Bluetooth channel, but I don't know if we want to trust the Google Play review process. There is a thing that I never really understood that Apple claimed, that they're able to filter artificial Bluetooth signals that come from antennas that are not phones. I really, if I put my physics hat on, I really don't see how it will work. And I'd be very interested to know if anybody has tried to fool an iPhone using artificial Bluetooth signal and has succeeded, because Apple claims this is not very likely to happen. And let me spend a little time about this countermeasure, which is not public yet, but Google is already talking about it. So I think that's okay for me to talk about it here. At some point, they're going to roll out a rate limiting mechanism that basically prevents a single key to be responsible for a large number of notifications. Basically, the system would check how many notifications are associated to a particular key. And in that case, if it's too large, they would stop those notifications. There are several issues with this. It's not clear, first of all, how it's going to implement it, because there is no documentation around it. There's probably privacy issues around it, because they would have to collect more information they already do. Also, Vincenzo Iovino in Salerno has shown that you can do what he calls a time travel attack. You can use keys that have already been uploaded by real infected users to create fake notification on backdated devices. Now, this means that I can make an attack on myself because I own that device. But the interesting thing about this attack, which by the way can be launched with no resources, all you need is a bunch of phones, basically. What happened is that it increased the official number of notifications that was kept by the Italian health minister. About, so interesting, if those are the counters that they're going to be used for this rate limiting mechanism, which again, we don't know because it hasn't been rolled out yet, we can manipulate them by just using real keys from real impacted people. In particular, we could trigger the rate limiting mechanism on real keys of infected people and stop those real notifications from going out. So conclusion, I believe that large-scale replay attacks are still possible, and the countermeasures are not sufficient, and they're possibly more damaging than actual the thing that they're trying to fix. Were they used in the recent elections? There is no evidence of that. This is probably due to the low adoption rate of the apps, which we think is the real reason why this attack is not attractive to the adversary. It's not the cost, it's not the easiness of misinformation campaign, is really that right now nobody's using it. And by the way, this was also brought as a reason to not worry about this. Basically, the app is secure because nobody's really using it, which I don't, we shouldn't be buying it. Did we dodge a bullet? I think we did. While adoption overall in the US is very low, there are pockets of high adoption. For example, college campuses that reopen, use of the app was strongly encouraged by the administration. One particular example is the University of Illinois. Illinois as a state does not have an app, but the University of Illinois deployed one and bundled it up with the app for building access, meaning that it's probably almost universally adopted on campus. College campuses are usually pockets of democratic votes and therefore attractive targets for voter suppressions. And college campuses have large population, which could have been sufficient to flip certain swing states. Here, look at the state of Georgia at a margin of 12 votes. Just the state university population is bigger than 300,000 votes. In Arizona, similar, and Wisconsin, similar numbers. Did we dodge a worse bullet? And I think that we also dodged a worse bullet in the sense that it's been almost a month since the election and Trump has not conceded. It's an unprecedented attack in the United States on the legitimacy of the election results. They've been questioning the validity of many established voting procedures, for example, voting by mail without any evidence. The system is cracking, but so far is resisting. And the only reason it's resisting is the courts are protecting the integrity of the US democratic processes by dismissing lawsuits, mostly due to the lack of evidence. But what if there was evidence? What if an attack had been launched against a geographical area populated by Trump voters? For example, before I said that campuses are usually progressive, but they're also in the US very religious conservative campuses. What if the attack was launched there, was later revealed to have happened, and they would have just to create more chaos in post-election and provide evidence to those lawsuits that would have meant delay or block vote certification. Why not suspend notification? I mean, there would not cost, 2 days, 3 days, or no notification. The public health impact would have been minimal. And yet the suggestion was strongly opposed by Google and Apple. And I suspect this was a PR issue, as it would have meant an admission of the weaknesses in the system. What are the lessons? Well, the most important for me, and again, as an activist rather than as a researcher, is that public health is among the most important roles of government. And we have to think about these apps as an official government channel from the government to its citizens around a very important topic, public health. And this communication channel cannot be left open to tampering. It has to be secure. Privacy is important, but so is security. The issue for me is not centralized versus decentralized, but it's secure versus insecure. As a crypto researcher, I'm really kind of sad that we have this wonderful simulation paradigm that emulates an ideal world, as Benny was just saying, and it's just been thrown out the window. Finally, never underestimate the potentials for new technologies to be abused. How many of us would have predicted that social media platforms would be abused for election misinformation and voter suppression 5-6 years ago? I think we haven't seen the extent of possible abuse of this contact tracing technology yet. So sorry if I ran out a little bit out of time. But.
So no. It's I hope that we will have maybe 5 minutes delay or 10 minutes delay in general, but this is normal. So I assume you're finished, Rosario. Yeah. Thanks a lot for many interesting insights that I think many people, I mean, the lobbyists, they don't care, but many people also in our among our politicians do not have the so to say the real vision to understand that these things can have consequences in the future. Now we can go to one question. There were some questions on chat. You can definitely answer to them, for example, elaborating on Illinois. But is there any question we can have for one question before we go to the?
Sure. So I've been trying to get more data on the University of Illinois. So what I know is that I got this information from Nikita Borisov, who is not a very famous cryptographer. I asked him, and he said that although the state of Illinois does not have an app, the university developed their own app using the Gaian API, and they bundled it up with the building access, particularly because they wanted to make sure that people who have been notified wouldn't be actually denied access to a building. The contact tracing part of this bundled up is optional, and I've been trying to get numbers on the opt-in rate to the contact tracing part of the app, but I have not yet got those numbers. Okay. And in general, by talking to other people across other campuses, there was always, in the campuses that have reopened, there was a big push for students and staff to download and use the app in all those campuses, although it was never mandatory.
Okay, so is there any other question? Otherwise, we move on to the next speaker. So, Lisa, shall we do that now?
Yes, you can do it. I don't see another question.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rosario, for this in these insights.